What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be diving into 5 decks that are relatively on the cheaper side when it comes to playing competitive Magic in MTG Arena. All these decks are best of 1 decks, and they're all doing fairly well, all with an overall win percentage of 50% or greater, which is definitely a good thing. But yet again, these decks aren't going to break the bank if you're looking to craft a new deck. If you haven't decided on what to craft, maybe this video will help you out. With that out of the way, let's just dive into the decks and let's start talking about them. So the first deck up on the list is going to be Mono Blue Tempo. This deck is actually pretty inexpensive overall, coming in at 5 rares, 18 total uncommons, 15 commons, and then the 22 lands, with most of the, rares being the Haughty Jin, the new card from Dominaria United, being 4 of in the deck with 3 mana flyer that is power and toughness equal number instants of sorcery cards in a graveyard. Instant and sorcery spells also cost 1 less to cast, which makes all our 2 mana counter spells that much less to cast, as well as, the other land being Otawara here as a bounce spell. But, this is definitely a deck that plays a decent amount of, counter spells, right? We're in a meta where mono black, there's Rakdos, there's a lot of decks that are definitely very aggressive, and we have to have some sort of way to disrupt what our opponent's trying to do. We have ways to disrupt their spells when they tap out. Getting them with a surprise spell pierce is one card. We also have, things like negate, just a straight up counter spell. They can't pay anything to not counter it. We have essence capture, just a counter target creature spell, also putting a counter on one of our creatures, making that creature that much bigger. And then we have ways to protect what we have on the battlefield. Like we have slip out the back. We have things like fading hope, ways to just kind of bounce things back. But it's definitely a deck that is a little bit on the uptrend. It started when standard first, was first happening with rotation and everything. This deck was slightly below 50%. We're trending upward at 50.1%, which is definitely not bad. The game's average on most times take about 5 minutes or so to play. And, this deck being, for what it is, being very limited on the budget, is to have over a 50% win rate in a deck, in a meta where there's a lot of decks that play a ton of rares. This is definitely a good place to look at if you're into that kind of aggro tempo style Magic. The next deck up on the list is kind of similar to the last deck, though this one is more of a tempo deck in the way that we're doing things to kind of pump up our creatures and play cantrips type spells to then also get advantages to kind of keep that tempo up. And we're playing, this one is Azorius Tempo. This one is a little bit more expensive overall. There are 16 total rares, 12 of them actually coming from the mana base with the dual lands. So that is one of those areas that if you're kind of limited on rare wildcards, you can kind of build the main portion of the deck and then maybe slowly over time build into the rare mana base. Some of the easiest ways to kind of slim that down is, we got a Ganjo, we have also Otawara Sorin City. You could easily replace those for plains and an island if you needed to. We also have, the dual lands here that you could easily add in the tap dual lands if you want to, though the one upside to playing untapped dual lands outside of Deserted Beach is the fact that you then are able to be aggressive. You don't have to have lands tapped down, which then allows you to kind of keep things open. That is the one downside compared to playing, non-dual lands. Overall, right now, this one is also trending up. We're at roughly a 50.6 win rate. These decks, tempo decks are definitely one of those things that's kind of that branching path between being an aggro deck as well as being a little bit control-y. This is a deck that we're just trying to disrupt what our opponent's doing in the early game, and hopefully that we can do enough on the battlefield, keep our hand kind of full, pump our creatures up, and protect them, that we can kind of overrun our opponent before they really get their game plan going. There's a lot there's a lot in this deck that helps us get there. We have things like combat research, which is just a good way to enchant a creature, allowing that creature, whenever it deals damage to an opponent, we get to draw a card. If we have a legendary creature, we get a +1/+1. It has ward 1, though this deck doesn't play any legendary creatures. We also play things like Illuminated Virtuoso, just another 1/1 double striker that we get to connive every single time that we target it with a spell. We have Ledger Shredder that we gain benefits of whenever a player casts their second spell. We get to connive as well, which allows us to possibly grow this card. Also, it happens each turn. It's not just on our turn that happens. We have Storm Chaser Drake, same thing. Whenever you target with a spell, we get to draw a card straight up. So this deck is pretty much a balance of, this is where our main creature base is, and then a lot of our one-drops are mostly cantrips to target our creatures, to protect them and or disrupt what our opponent's doing. So overall, yet again, just like the last deck, if you're into that aggro style, tempo-y, control-y style deck, this could be another deck for you. The matches, just like the last one, are relatively on the shorter side, a little under 5 minutes with this deck, but it's definitely a deck to check out if you're into this style of Magic and maybe have some of these cards already in your collection. Now, the next deck up on the list is a deck that I feel like is always on these lists just because its budget is fairly low, and that's going to be Rakdos Sacrifice. This deck contains 5 mythics, 10 rares, 6 of them are lands, so it's definitely not that bad in the rare side. There are also 17 uncommons, 16 commons, 4 of them being technically the common tap dual lands. And then there's just a basis of 6 and 6 when it comes to mountains and swamps. So yet again, a very low curve style deck. If you haven't seen this deck, the gist of it is we try to play some artifacts out using a card named Unequaled Anvil. Whenever we sacrifice an artifact, whether it's a creature or one of our artifacts that are just not a creature on the battlefield, we get to create a 1/1 Spirit Construct token. And then we can also tap the Unequaled Anvil to force a sacrifice, but we also have just other ways to sacrifice them. We have Blood Tithe Harvester, which creates blood tokens that we can sacrifice for paying 1 mana to discard a card and sacrifice an artifact and draw a card, which will then trigger Unequaled Anvil. We also are playing things like Nixilis in the deck as another interesting card here, just to put pressure on our opponent, because just like, the mono black decks of the format that are playing like Liliana, make your opponent have to make the tough choice of either discarding a card or losing 2 life. Is definitely one of those things that maybe in the early game they will do, but towards the late game when their life points are starting to get low, this is definitely another way to kind of push that points of damage at their face, where they may have to start really discarding some spells they really don't want to. On top of that, if we have the Devil token out when we do get the casualty, we can also gain life in the process, which is definitely pretty good for Nixilis. He's also made a little bit of a resurgence in the meta, as well as I feel like he was a little awkward in the previous meta, but now that we're in a more limited meta, it's definitely a much better card. And of course, like the big card of the deck, I think this is definitely a great card for the deck, being Fable the Mirror Breaker. It's a 3-mana enchantment that has 3 chapters. If you haven't seen this enchantment, it's first chapter we get a 2/2 red Shoveling creature that whenever it attacks, we get to create a treasure token. Chapter 2 is we can discard up to 2 cards and we draw that many cards. And chapter 3 is we get a 2/2 Reflection of Kiki-Jiki creature that we can tap it, and create a token of target non-legendary creature we control, except it has haste and sacrifice the thing in next end step. So overall, this deck is definitely very good. It's definitely very competitive. It can really grind games out just because those other, mono black decks of the format are also very grindy. I think this one can be much more grindy and put a lot more pressure on your opponent. I would say the one downside is that we really only have 2 ways of dealing with like a Shieldred, just because we only play Infernal Grasp and also Meathook Massacre. Those are really the 2 big ways to really deal with their board. But other than that, we hopefully can deal with it with Blood Type Harvester, tapping sacrifices, maybe making a token with the Reflection of Kiki-Jiki, which then produces another blood token, which then hopefully allows us to get enough blood tokens to give -X/-X. But just overall, it's definitely a deck that is kind of like the deck out of all the decks from the previous meta that kind of still is in the top of the meta, I would say, in the pool of other decks of the format. So I mean, if you already had this deck, pretty much built, there are no really other cards in this deck other than maybe, actually there aren't any new cards in this deck. This deck is pretty much what it was prior to rotation, so that definitely puts you in a good spot. And if I didn't go over this already, it's about a 52% win rate. And, this deck is a little bit more grindy. It doesn't win games quickly. It takes roughly about 7.5 minutes to complete a game with this deck. It could take longer. It could take shorter, depending on how you draw and what your opponent's playing. But overall, this is another good deck if you're looking to get into the competitive Magic and you're not really looking to spend a lot when it comes to crafting. This is definitely a good place to start. So the next deck up on the list is going to be Mono Red Aggro. This is another deck that's kind of popped up. I think it kind of replaced almost in a way like the Boros Aggro of the meta of old. This is a deck that is yet again very cheap. It's got 5 mythics. It's got 6 rares, one of them being a land. It's got 21 uncommons and 6 commons, and the rest is 22 mountains. This deck is, you see various versions of it. Some playing some cards, some playing other cards. This is kind of, I felt like, the one that had the most games played, so I felt like this is the best representation of what Mono Red Aggro is currently in the format. The other thing of this thing, the one thing of this deck is that it does have a lot of spells that definitely help us out. It definitely pushes damage. It definitely has good spot removal. It also has other ways of us just dealing damage, hopefully getting over the top that your opponent gets really low on life points before they can really sustain and stabilize the battlefield. You know, in the 1-drop slot, we have things like Kamano faces Kakazan. This card was a beast in Boros Aggro before rotation. This card's still really good. That if we can get this on turn 1 and follow it up with a nice turn 2 play, we get a creature with additional +1/+1 counter on it. So that sets us up very well. You can, you know, play Kamano on turn 1, play a Sheffian Dragon on turn 2 as a 2/2 flying haster. That's not a bad, you know, combo there. You can also do it with a Bloodthirsty Adversary. Maybe make your Electrostatic Infantry also a 2/3 on the turn it comes down the battlefield. Definitely not bad there. You know, just overall, what we're trying to do is just push damage and then also maybe burn the opponent in the process. You know, the one other good way this deck works very well is that, you know, Thunder Raiju is another card that helps us push that damage, because a lot of the cards that we do play in this deck get counters on them based on when they come out on the battlefield. So things like, you know, Shivian Devastators, just based on the counters that we tapped for X with it. If we get Phoenix Check back from the graveyard, it comes back on the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. Bloodthirsty Adversary, if we pay that additional mana, it also gets a +1/+1 counter, and we then get to play an instant or sorcery spell from our graveyard again. And then Electrostatic Infantry, every time we play instant or sorcery, it gets +1/+1. And it has trample, so this deck is definitely very explosive. It's a deck that tries to just overwhelm your opponent very, very quickly. As you see, the curve isn't very high. Really, most of the deck is here with just a couple cards in the top end. I mean, Squeak is definitely not a bad card. It's just a one-off in the deck. You know, it's not one of the main win cons. I really think if you get like an Electrostatic Infantry out and have a good amount of spells, you can really take over the game. Though the one downside is we are susceptible to spot removal, or just because, you know, we play a fair amount of creatures, but we don't play a ton of creatures that we're just gonna get very wide on our opponent. So, you know, yet again, a deck that wins very, very well, wins very, very quickly. I think out of the 5 decks, this is the quickest when it comes to games, where it comes a little bit over 4 minutes per game when it comes to playing this deck. You either win really quick or you lose very quickly, just because it's one of those decks that really just, you know, has to be on the play, has to be aggressive to really take any sort of a, you know, to put your opponent in a position where they can't really pull it off. And also the benefit here with this deck is it does have a 55% win rate, 55.5% win rate overall. So it's towards the top of the meta, though I would say Mono Black and that stuff is technically still at the top, being closer to 60% win rate. So it's not there, but it's getting there. I mean, it's in a good spot that you are favored to win a lot of your matchups, just because if you get a good hand, you can, you know, just pop off and win games quickly. So yet again, if you have a decent amount of wild cards, most, you know, really just need 11 or so wild cards, maybe 10 if you cut out the Sokuzan. Not a bad deck also to start out with. It's definitely a fun deck, plays a mixture of new and old cards, which definitely is kind of one of those things I do think that everyone should do, is instead of playing like a deck they already have, maybe explore and play other decks. So this is yet again another deck if you want to check it out and play. And the last deck up on the list is a familiar favorite. This is a deck that's just been around since Kamigawa, pretty much. It is Selesnya Enchantments. It's just a very low curve deck. It comes in at 4 rares, with 2 of the rares being Wet Announcements, 2 of the rares being Kami of Transcience. It has 24 uncommons. It has 14 commons, for them being the dual common land. And then, you know, there's 18 total lands, basic lands in the deck, so it comes in at 22 lands because the curve is fairly low. The goal of this deck is just to play enchantments, play, you know, ways to pump our creatures up. It is susceptible. I would say the one downside is susceptible to spot removal, just like any deck. You know, if the opponent's playing heavy spot removal, we may be in for a bad time, but we have a lot of ways to kind of hopefully maybe just overwhelm our opponent fairly quickly. You know, Generous Visitor is a good card, being a 1-mana 1/1 that every time we cast an enchantment spell, we get the +1/+1 counter on target creature, whether it's itself or one of our other creatures. We have things like Mashako's Reign of Truth, based on how many enchantments are artifacts and/or enchantments on the battlefield. We get to give a target creature +1/+1 for each of them, and then on the third chapter we get the creature side, which is a creature that has +1/+1 for each artifact or enchantment we control. Just another deck that I think is definitely in a good spot. It's just like Mono Red, it's a very explosive deck. You're looking for that solid curve where you have, you know, a 1-drop, a couple 2-drops, and then hopefully you can kind of get going before your opponent really has any sort of way to kind of put things in front of you. I would say that's the one downside to this. The only thing that we have in the deck that really has trample is a Kami of Transcience. So that is one of those things where if our opponent has a lot of things that can just, you know, chump blockers, we have a lot of creatures that really won't get through damage. We only play one creature that has flying, which is the Skyblessed Samurai, which is a creature that costs 1 less for each art enchantment creature control. But still, nonetheless, this deck is also performing fairly well in the overall meta. This deck is at 56.1% win rate. You know, it's not as quick as a Mono Red deck. You know, it's slightly slower, coming out at 5.5 minutes as well with this deck. But it's a deck that for what it is, it's just very solid on all the pieces that it has. It has a couple pieces from other sets, but mostly this is a deck from Kamigawa, so it's not a deck that you're gonna have to really diverse your pack openings. If you're looking to buy, get the packs to hopefully build this deck, you can really focus on Kamigawa, and then the additional wild cards, you can always craft the cards from the other sets that you may not have. Also, with it being only a 4 rare total deck, is definitely very playable. With it also being the fact that it's in the top of the meta, it's definitely a deck to check out. I know there's some of you guys I think have mentioned that you are playing a deck like this, and I understand. I think the one benefit of playing like a cheap competitive deck is I think that you have to have a deck that at least gets you those daily wins, and then you can build up and build that second deck or third deck, depending on how many how much currency and gold and gems you guys have, to then explore other deck ideas. So if you kind of build a deck and it doesn't do as well, this deck, at least you have this to fall back on to at least have a deck that's going to push, get your daily wins, maybe push up the rank ladder. All these decks I think are in good spots, and they all have different kind of play styles depending on what kind of Magic player you are. I would say, the other decks that wouldn't make the list, unfortunately, are like the control decks, and then some of the other aggro decks of the format, just because a lot of those are, right now, because the card pool is so small, are very heavy in rares and mythics. And as we get more sets, we may see those those decks kind of disperse some a little bit. Some of them may still have a ton of rares and mythics, but we'll get other decks that may be able to be competitive with a little bit less. And yet again, we're also fairly early into the season. This is coming about a week. I'm recording this a week after the set has come out, so we're still kind of exploring. I don't think we got into the pinnacle of seeing what is going to be really the top deck. Mono black is the favorite, but it could always change. But if you like this video and want to know when I post new videos like this, hit that subscribe button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you like the video, hit that like button. Definitely also helps out a lot. If you want to check out any of the decks, they'll be in the description below, like always. And until next time, I'll see you in the next video. Just want to give a special shout out to the channel members here on my YouTube channel. You can also become a channel member yourself down below the video, hitting that join button. It definitely helps out a lot, and I just appreciate you guys for your support.